Mr. Ian Lesser, Vice President for Foreign Policy and the General Marshal Fund of the United States.
It's very good to be with you. Thank you.
Let's talk a little bit about Trump, the new American administration and foreign policy. My first question is about Trump Doctrine. Is there any Trump Doctrine?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's no Trump doctrine as such, but I think we could say a few things which many people have discussed, which actually go into making a doctrine if there is one. Just a couple of the elements. I mean, clearly the president seems to have a much more transactional approach to foreign policy. Less values-based. This is not totally unusual in the American experience, but he thinks much more narrowly about American national interest than some of his predecessors. Probably there is a kind of challenging approach, a kind of iconoclastic approach to American alliances. He talks about burden sharing, which isn't new, especially in Europe. But the difference is he's not only talking about it in terms of money. What he isn't mentioning, he is talking about it in terms of money. What he isn't mentioning is the American national interest in this. And so he views things as a transaction. And I think that's, in some ways, the heart of it. But it doesn't always work very well in foreign policy.
Mm-hmm. And then there's also another characteristic, this unpredictability of Trump.
Unpredictability, partly because he's not experienced in foreign policy, but this also is not always a new thing in American presidents. Mm-hmm. He also has a tendency to emphasize hard power over soft power, hard power instruments, the military, over aid and investment and diplomacy. Mm-hmm. And that, in a way, is new.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about the transatlantic relationship. Trump was in Brussels with the European leaders. From your point of view, how's this relationship and what's the future?
Well, I think transatlantic relations are, in some ways, these are the most important relationships globally for the United States and Europe, but simply the weight of the transatlantic economic relationship, political cooperation, security cooperation, all of these things, it's not going to change, whoever is the president in Washington. So I think those are structural, those are things that are not going to go away, including the American commitment in Article 5 and NATO and so forth. I think that's pretty solid. That said, the president's visit was not well received in Brussels. It was a surprise to many people. He didn't give the kind of reassuring messages that many had hoped he would give. And it's certainly taking Europe a long time to get used to the personality of this new president, that's for sure.
But do you think this trip to Brussels was in some ways symbolic because Trump met European leaders first and he didn't met Putin, for example? Mm.
Well, I think it was intended, the whole visit, whether it was with the EU institutions or whether it was NATO, was intended, it was all about symbolism. It was a very brief visit. The issues at stake, whether it was about Russia sanctions or trade agreements or defense spending, were not going to be resolved with this visit, however it was prepared. So it was all about the messaging. And the messaging turned out to be rather problematic, both with the EU, where I think many leaders came off with an impression that the president wasn't really still very much interested in the European project. And at NATO, where the message was delivered in a way that I think was badly received by many allies. They were not surprising messages about burden sharing or counterterrorism cooperation. And many Europeans would agree with that, but the style, I think, many found very difficult.
What about other issues, for example, North Korea or Qatar, for example, Iran? Tell me something about the American foreign policy.
Well, this is one of the most problematic things because inevitably things will simply happen in the world. There are crises that will appear where the American administration is going to have to respond, and there is I would say, in a way, a weakened capacity to respond because a lot of the sort of senior level of policymakers below the level of cabinet appointees are simply not in place. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the structure to respond to crises and in fact to make policy over the longer term, they're not there, the people aren't there. So it's difficult, and it maybe reinforces the importance of the president's own personality and his personal approach, but also people around him. There's a very serious problem of stability on the Korean Peninsula. This is in some ways driving the approach to China. The president came in sounding very tough on China, but it becomes clear that in order to have any resolution, even stability on the Korean Peninsula, China has to be involved. And so that's inevitably taken the edges off of some of this interaction with Beijing. There are many other things like this where the president has stepped back from much more assertive policies when he came into office. Maybe we'll see more of that. But so far, there's a high degree of unpredictability, and it's not helping our alliance relationships, if I can say.
And finally, about the bilateral relationship between Spain and the U.S., what's your view about this important relationship for us, and what will be the future?
Well, the bilateral relationship between Spain and the United States is a good one, and it's extremely important. And I think this administration will clearly acknowledge that. But that said, the relationship will be affected by the overall character of relations between the United States and Europe, on trade, on defense, on other things. I think the emphasis on counterterrorism will probably give the United States a steady, growing, maybe, stake in Mediterranean security. That probably is in Spain's interest. But I think at the same time, the United States is likely to look to Europe and countries in southern Europe, in a sense, to take the lead in North Africa, even in Africa. And that will inevitably put more burdens on actors like Spain. So it's a bit of a mixed picture, and we'll simply have to see how it comes out.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. See you next time.
Thank you. Good to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.